Or come to the meeting.
If Hemp Street is still alive,
Can you take your vacation between meetings?
What?
Can you take your vacation between meetings?
I think you did, didn't you?
just ask him. Jimmy Hemp Street was one of the snarkiest guys. Great, I love Jimmy. He would come up with his one-liners, like stuff like that would happen.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to hold for a couple minutes for a couple members who are on their way. So we're recording, so try and look your best.
We heard you coming. I'm getting blamed for everything.
All right, let's. We're going to call the Finance Committee meeting to order. Present, John Cusick, Tara Zarinsky, myself, Ron Heckman, currently at least, and Bill McGee and Matt Dietz are also here for now. So I guess, well, we have courtesy of the floor. Start with that. Anyone who'd like to address council? Seeing no one, let's go to our discussion regarding the amendment to ordinance number 526, 2010, Northampton County Governmental Accounting Standards Board Statement number 54, Fund Balance Policy Ordinance. Now, I don't know how we want to do this. You know, I've been looking at it. I'm sure members of council have been looking at it, the committee. Would you like to have the fiscal director come up and speak to his thoughts, or the executive, or should
Mr. Chairman,
you want to do his questions? Yes.
Would you indulge me by way of introduction?
Mr. McClure, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I'll be very brief. The issue of amending this ordinance was first brought to my attention by Mr. Kraft. When he did bring it to my attention, I looked at it. It immediately occurred to me that the ordinance as drafted and passed was violative of the Home Rule Charter. I asked our Assistant County Solicitor, Mr. Brennan, who is here with us today, to review the ordinance and analyze it for me and you. And he's here today prepared to discuss with you what he found. Parenthetically, the Director of Fiscal Affairs, Mr. Barron, when I raised this issue with him, informed me of a fact which I did not know because I did not read every word of the ordinance, that he is charged from time to time with reviewing this ordinance specifically. So he did that. So he's here today prepared to discuss that and answer any questions you might have about the amendments to the ordinance itself. The thing that I wish to leave with you before you start your questioning of them and hopefully getting the answers you're looking for is that government by lawsuit is bad government. The reason that we are here before you with the amendments is to avoid that. It is not in my nature to have these disputes settled by courts. I think we can, working together, make sure that the ordinance is compliant with the Home Rule Charter. The problem I have is that with the advice that I've received and based on my own reading of the ordinance, it is unlawful. So I'm put in a position of, one, having to conduct myself from a posture that I believe is not legal, which I am sworn not to do. On the other hand, I'm also sworn to uphold the ordinances and administer the ordinances as drafted and ultimately passed by council. So as you can see, it puts us in a catch-22, and if we can't amend the ordinance as written, then we probably will then need to get a judge to decide the issue for us. What happens then is you may lose the entire ordinance, and one of the things that Mr. Barron was so adamant about when we began talking about this was keeping the accounting regulations. And let's be clear about what GASB 54 is. They are accounting regulations. They're not law. However, council decided that it would incorporate accounting regulations into our law. The amendments to the ordinance preserve the GASB regulations in our law. And Mr. Barron has more to say about that and what effects that might have. Thank you very much for indulging me. Mr. Brennan can outline however you want to do it. Yeah.
Hello, everyone.
No, it's okay. It's okay. My thought was, unless somebody's walking over anybody talking, just having more of a free flow kind of discussion. I'm going to just start because I'm going to ask you, since you walked up, I have a question right out of the gate. I went through this multiple times and I read it. I'm not as concerned with the shoulds as opposed to the wills. I get that. I mean, but I guess and correct me if I'm wrong, the point that the executive is making for the most part, I guess, is going right to that the financial stabilization fund. I don't know if that in and of itself was a problem, or the wills versus recommended.
I think the underlying problem with the ordinance as written is the Home Rule Charter. There's no inherent separation of powers at a local level. We're pretty much run by whatever our Home Rule Charter says. And the Home Rule Charter has a section that defines the executive function, has a section that defines the legislative function. The biggest problem with the ordinance is it's council directing the executive to have an end result, when that result should really be reached on a yearly basis based on a proposed budget, amendments, a possible veto, and then an override. So the Northampton County Charter has an unusually well-defined structure for budgeting, and this ordinance takes away much of the process that the charter calls for, and I think and I'm not necessarily directly involved with the exact wording, but what the ordinance attempts to do is to make that discretionary, and it's going to fall within the regular budgeting format. Another problem with the ordinance is we have a fund that's created, a few years ago that's sort of outside the budgeting process, when the Home Rule Charter specifically states that all funds are to be budgeted basically on a yearly basis. So it's hard to reconcile the direction from the ordinance with the charter itself. Yeah, the stabilization fund. I mean,
so that should be included in the budget, according to the
it could be,
but it's not, right?
it could be included in the budget. It could be included in the budget. I think the problem more so is that
because it's locked, as you said, it's not. It normally maybe be part of the general fund or one of the
Well, I think that the budgeting decisions can be made on a year-to-year basis based on what the charter is written in a way that budgeting decisions are made on a year-to-year basis based on the council that is addressing it, based on the executive who is here. There's a proposal for a budget. There is a possible amendments. There is a potential veto or even a line item veto, essentially in the home rule charter, and then there's also the potential that council overrides that. So this takes it out of that usual budget process and calls for a preordained even amount that has to be included for the stabilization when it should really be being addressed on a year-to-year basis.
So, I mean, and I want to understand where the administration's coming from. I mean, to me, there's a few points here for me. One is council, whether you think this was necessary or a good ordinance or not, that's council. But the executive brought up some points about the law, and I know in the past that has come up at various times between council and the executive. Now, if you go through the home rule charters, I know you have, money really comes under the purview of the county council. The budget, everything.
Adoption.
If you look at the section on the executive, there isn't a whole lot to say about money. Now, that's not to say, obviously, other than he prepares the budget and he comes to us. So I guess my fundamental question would be, is ultimately you're saying specifically that the idea of a specific fund where, and I understand Gadsby, I've known Duran for 30 years, an accountant, he's one of the best county accountants you can have, but if we're up to the county departments, we have half of our general fund in a lockbox. I mean, they're extremely conservative, God bless them. But council ultimately makes that decision. So to me, do we need this or not need it? That's one thing. The other thing, though, is this legal issue. So you're saying specifically, it's this idea of locking away a specific amount of money in a fund, that separate fund that council controls is what is creating the problem. Because theoretically, after the executive presents the budget, if he wants more money, other than the percentage he's allowed to transfer, he's got to come to council anyway.
Yeah.
Well, because I really want to understand this, and that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
Let me finish my question. I'm sorry. What, come on, I've been trying to say that to somebody. Since I got back on council, I used to yell at administration. What specific part of that lockbox makes it different than the idea of the actual budget, which you have to come to us for anyway if you don't know?
As it's presented in the budget, your question is a good one, because this particular ordinance says these funds reside outside the budget process, which the county executive presents the budget to county council. And these funds are required by this ordinance and essentially take that power away from the executive. To your point about Gadsby 54, I have an email that I'll share during my presentation, which talks about how we're still compliant with Gadsby 54. There's even mention in the email about how the power needs to reside with the highest level of government to commit funds in this way. However, since we have such a divided government and a government that is so prescriptive with regard to the time, manner, and presentation of our budget, committing funds without running afoul of that process is extremely difficult, and I don't even know. I've tried to figure out a way to make it possible. I don't even know that it is. So anyhow, I'll let you ask Tim, or if you have questions.
I just want to answer that too. And I mean, ultimately, council does.
Hold on, Steve. You have a question. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So say we had a fund, just say we had set money aside for prison or for human services. Is that money that we've put away different years and set aside and allocated it towards buying the human services building, whether we want to or not, is that?
That's governed by a completely different process that falls within the budget. That is laid
out. How's that different?
Because it's a capital improvement. It is earmarked for a specific capital project that can roll from year to year. So that money was set up, I think, we're in year 2. When we do 2019, that $14 million, it will go into year 3, which we're allowed to carry over. And our first option to buy the building is March of 2019. So that falls within the normal budget process. This money while it's not committed to anything except this, it's committed to emergency stabilization fund, but it's not reserved anywhere. The money in the capital budget is reserved for specific projects, and after 3 years, it rolls back into the general fund by ordinance. However, we're in year 2 of that money being put aside, so therefore, we have 1 more year of that money rolling forward. I believe all the money is there right now, and it will roll forward to 19 for us to be able to, go forward with whatever we do in the 2019 budget.
Yeah, so I guess the differences that I see about hamstringing the administration is the money that was put aside that's in the lockbox now was past budgeted, past administration, so it's not taken out of the control of what's going on in the administration now, the budget's now.
I don't. So the money, the way it sits right now, needs to meet certain criteria. And let me give you a real life example. I was going to use this in my presentation, but let me give you a real life example. Imagine we had no $14 million for.
What?
It's under the desk there.
Oh, you got me.
Thank you.
Ken, you're way too tall for that chair. I knew it.
She is nervous and out of breath.
Thank you for responding. Thank you. Mr. Barron, she get a little wild. We're okay, we're covered now.
So.
Well, I knew they weren't just cows you're looking in.
God,
There was something
you
different
guys
about
out
this.
already.
Yeah, there's a panic button there. Yeah, I knew that.
I had no idea.
I guess I forgot to tell you that when you took that seat.
Thank God it wasn't feeling cold.
Look, sorry about that.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
So let me give you. Oops.
Sorry.
It works.
Very good. So.
We're going to probably get billed for that, to be honest.
Yeah. So let me give you a real life example. Imagine we had no unrestricted, unreserved fund balance, which is sitting somewhere around $19 million right now. Imagine we had no $14 million in the capital money, and the only money we had was that $17.1 million in the lockbox. The lockbox, okay? We had no other general fund money. All the revenue would come in. It was all budgeted for and encumbered. Now, say the Militis building, which we would agree there's issues over there that are resulting in an emergency situation because one of the county's core functions is voters, right? We have to provide services for voter registration. If we couldn't touch the money in the lockbox because in this ordinance, which is language that is struck out, the emergency would have to be over between $2 million and $4 million. The formula isn't very clear. The other part of it is the ordinance is not very clear with regard to when you would trigger, what the threshold is. I figured it out 2 different ways. One says $2 million, one says $4 million. Either way, it's a large threshold to meet. And over at the Militis building, I do not believe it's going to cost that much. So now you have to bring that building up to code or do whatever it is we have to do to make that building okay. You don't have any other money, so where do you go get it, is the question. And if you have to cut services somewhere else while you're sitting on $17.1 million, it makes it a little bit of a tough pill to swallow because you haven't met the threshold of, being able to tap that fund. And
I guess I'll go to say, so maybe, one, we just fix the threshold and that verbiage so we can fix things here. But because what I could foresee, and which is the reason why they created the lockbox, in my opinion, is this year we take that money, fix the Militis building, and you're still back in the same situation where in a couple budgets you could be at what you have in there is already accounted for, and then what do you do?
And I understand that. I understand that point. And the county executive, I think, when he's talked to the members of council, has been clear. We're going to have an emergency stabilization fund. The difference is under the Gadsby 54 standard, it doesn't. If we call this money committed and it goes outside the budget process, we're in violation of the Administrative Code and Home Rule Charter. If we move it from committed to uncommitted but still keep it in that bucket, Back years ago when we used to have these GASB 54 discussions, we used to talk about putting the funds in buckets and having it measurable as to what the money was used for. An example of a reserved bucket would be the Humor Trust that we have. We have about, I think, $2 or $3 million of money that sits in our general fund budget that is restricted and reserved because of the trust. So we can only use that for Humor Park. That being the case, for this specific, and we accepted it as a gift with those conditions. So it has a special place in our general fund because of other laws that govern it. So therefore,
we need to reset the key. Somebody pressed the panic alarm.
yeah.
I thought I did.
Oh, you did reset it?
Yeah.
Oh,
But
okay.
you can come check it to make sure.
Yeah, as long as you use the key?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that, guys.
No problem.
You wanted to check.
I'm sorry.
It's a ringer.
What?
I appreciate it.
I got your question.
I know, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming up.
Yeah, that was.
So I don't exactly remember where I was, but
You would-
Are you already satisfied, Matt?
Well, I think you just finished the example, but
so the example I was saying was the Humor Park. So you would still have that money in a bucket, and what Mr. Brennan was talking about. So the county executive presents his budget with the $17.1 million or whatever that number is in the emergency stabilization fund. Council then has that budget to look at, review, make changes and amendments, and allocate spending accordingly. At that point, then, what would happen is you take it up or down on a vote. If you don't vote for it, then we tweak the budget, fix it, bring it back. If you vote for it, it could be vetoed, overridden. There's a process in place that's very prescriptive in the Home Rule Charter and the Administrative Code. So that is sort of, we're trying to bring that more into compliance, and the consequences of having the ordinance just thrown out with regard to the accounting standards we have to meet, what GASB 54 GASB 54 prescribes is it wouldn't be the best situation because it would affect our financial statements. The other, just in general, in keeping those standards, we reached out to your external auditors that the council hires. I have an email that I'll share with you that shows we are in compliance with GASB 54. If you look at page 2.
we're in compliance with this or without, with the amendments or with?
With the amendments.
Oh, sorry.
Hold on. Solicitor? I think I have enough for everybody. I'll get other copies.
That's all right. If it's all right with members of the committee, I'd like to, just for the time being, you can get back to this, Steve, but I know Mr. Kraft, this was an important thing for him. I'd like members of council to maybe discuss, and then we can always get back to it. Is that all right with the committee?
Can I just
Now,
the email?
When we're done.
Okay.
Then you can go over this.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah,
No problem.
Did you have any questions, Tom?
I don't really have any questions. I think what's
I'm going to recognize Ken, because this was
Okay.
his idea, so then maybe he can throw it out and we can.
I just wanted to say a couple things for the purpose of background. This ordinance was initially adopted in November of 2010. It came from the Stofa administration to council. Duran was the one who played the largest part in drafting it. It passed council 7-0 unanimously. Mr. McClure was not there that evening. Subsequent to that, it was amended in 2015, May, and I believe at that point it was strengthened. I wasn't here on council at the time, and that passed. I think it was a vote of 6-2. Mr. Kraft and Mr. McClure were the two no votes. So it's been in place for 8 years, almost, 7.5. It's worked. Well, the whole thing. So it was initially enacted in 2010. The amendments took place in 15. Now, some of the amendments that were made in 15 remain in the proposal. But I think, my concern is that what I see is that what this ordinance, to me, is doing is it is weakening council's hand in regards to what the fund balance will be. That's all.
Okay. Mr. Kraft, you would like to speak.
All right, well, the reason why I brought this up right away in the beginning of the year, and I wanted to throw the whole thing out, but then I was told, what we passed, John, with GASB 54 and all, you're absolutely correct. But the changes that they made with this lockbox is the only thing I'm talking about, because the executive sets revenue amounts every year. He sets the revenue amount for us to do a budget. If you remember when I had to get John Brown to reset his amount so we could give a raise that one year, and that's where it is. And all this money belongs in the fund balance. And the fund balance is directed by the GASB 54, and all the things that are in here, they're recommended to the executive how much money to keep in the fund balance and not to sink below it. I think this was a idea by two individuals after they did a tax increase to make themselves look better, that, hey, look here, we're fiscally responsible, we did this tax increase, now we're going to put it in a locked box. I think all those provisions were here on GASB 54 and everything we did in 10. And I think everything that they added, I wanted to take everything they did that time and just get rid of it all. I sent it in, and I think Mr. Barron had an aneurysm because they didn't want me to change all the things I wanted to change. And it went back and forth, and we mostly took out, the must and made them shoulds, and to make it more compliant with the Home Rule Charter. Because, the balance is a balance, and we're not restricting our ability for anything like that. We're just getting rid of this lock box that I believe goes against the Home Rule Charter, and I'm trying to correct that. And I think if you were here at the time, you would have voted the same way I did and said no to it. So that's why I did this. The administration got involved because I did this, and Duran wanted GASB 54, and everybody that went through, and Peg took it to everybody right away, and everybody had a fit because you couldn't get rid of GASB 54, and I understand that. But the only changes they're having have to do with this, this usurping of the authority of the executive to set, the revenue amounts for us to have our budgets every year. Everything else is called the general fund. The general fund is what we apply GASB 54 principles to, that we mandate the executive does. If he does something that we don't like, we say, hey, where's the fund balance? Why are you dipping into it? That's what you do. This was a runaround to try to make myself look better because I did a tax increase, and there was no reason, and I was surprised that Phil didn't call it at the time that it was against the Home Rule Charter, that it wasn't going in compliance with that. So that's why I did it. I mean, if anybody has questions, I know the administration's here because they, not Lamont specifically, but Mr. Barron, and they rewrote the things I wanted to take out because I wanted to. That's why some of the stuff's still in here that was changed, and that's why this is where it's at now.
Well, I mean, you folks were here in the back here. So, I mean, I'm sorry. I'm also, this is something for me, too, to figure, and that's why we're going back and forth on this. I mean, I don't know the motivation. Ms. Kraft has his feelings about the motivation. I remember this has gone back before Mr. Stoff even, and I know the Fiscal Affairs Office would always be very strong about you should have this much here, you should put this much, and I always looked at it as we had restricted and unrestricted. Mm-hmm. You have the general fund. If they give us a budget, if you want more money, you've got to come to us to get it. So when I read through this myself, I have to be perfectly honest, since I wasn't here when this happened, I thought when John Stoffel seemed to lean heavily into that, I thought, well, now we're getting into these little buckets, which really, in the end of the day, it's like a big tank of gas, and there's all these little buckets, and you're getting the same gas, even though it says 87 and 93 octane. It's all the general fund. We can decide what's not touchable or what is, but at the end of the day, I guess I sort of was confused because what somebody's emergency is, I was reading the example, maybe that's not somebody else's emergency. I mean, I don't know that we necessarily needed it. I don't know if we needed some of the stuff that was done during the Stoff administration. I just think a council that's doing their job and staying on top of things and following their budget they can't do anything money-wise other than what they budgeted unless they come to us, excluding the transfer between departments within a certain amount. But that's my feeling.
Yeah, I guess
Mr. Kusick.
what I would ask Mr. Barron,
Sure.
if he could just take us through each of the proposed changes that we have for this ordinance and the reason. Mr. Brennan, if you'd like to join him, that's fine. But I think I'd like some rationale for the items that are underlined.
Sure.
Well, I can go through all of that with you.
Yeah.
One of the things I just
Succinctly.
succinctly, yes. The biggest change here,
That's
Mr.
funny that you're
Kusick,
asking that.
and is that was good, Sarah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Wait, hold on. She's out of order. Please continue. No.
No, the biggest difference is from committed to the uncommitted.
Right.
And if you look at the email I gave you on page 2, that was part of the discussion that Jill and Mary Alice had from a financial statement standpoint. Initially, when I had worked to make some of the changes, we still tried to keep the money committed. We did try to do that, and
Right.
because of the things that were written out, it could no longer be committed. And I'll go over each one of those.
Okay, so I'm just, like I said, I think we start on page 4, and it starts with a strikeout of committed fund balance.
Yeah,
You know, if we could just go from there.
So that referenced the financial stabilization fund under committed. So therefore, that need to be stricken out. We still have a definition under the GASB 54 standards of what is committed, and that needs to stay in the ordinance on page 4 into page 5.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my one that I have all marked up.
Yeah, that's just a definition.
Does that? Yeah, it's
Done.
just a definition.
All right.
And since 1A was in there, we decided it was from creating the
Oh,
statutory.
I see. It's just this.
It's okay to just have it as a paragraph. It does not need to be denoted any other way because it is under section C. It doesn't need another note.
So 1 and 1A are deleted
Correct, because it's no
already in the
longer
definition?
committed. Yes.
Okay.
Under section 5 on page 6, where it goes committed to unassigned fund balance.
Yeah. What's the difference and why?
So the difference here is you wanted to still have the bucket for the emergency stabilization fund. But because the money could no longer fit the definition of committed, it goes under the unassigned fund balance in the general fund. And then what we did is, if you look, under number 2, it is recommended and suggested the 5% and the 15% for the current year. Now, yes, you could dip below the 5% because it's suggested, but I draw your attention to the 15%. If we had money set aside in this emergency stabilization fund, and when the county was very cash rich, as revenues come in, and we had a lot of cash flow, if I wanted to put money in there above the 15% from any other bucket in the fund balance to leverage our cash to make more interest, I couldn't do it. And that's the essence of fiscal responsibility. So that was suggested to be more on the high end for us because we have under Act, I believe it's Act 10, don't hold me to Act 10 or Act 5, we can invest in different funds that get us a little bit more interest because we are a high dollar investor.
Yeah, and again, my sense is that the 15% really isn't the issue. It's more we don't want you to go below, and from my thought, I'd rather keep 5 as a minimum. If you'd want to eliminate the 15, I can understand that. But I think that the issue we always had was not having a floor or a minimum here.
The 5 and the 15, just so you know, is also what's recommended by the standards. So using the suggested language, it is what is suggested by the standards. And remember, it's a standard, not a law. So I wanted to keep the ordinance to look like the standards and what is suggested.
And I think from a legal standpoint, it's also compelling the executive to have a pre-commitment to this when it's a process under the charter on a yearly basis that you're proposing a budget, which would allocate money to this, which council would have oversight over. So, and getting back to one of Mr. Heckman's questions, I mean, much of this could lead to the same result, or some of this could be leading to the same result, but it's conforming more so with the process that's laid out in the Home Rule Charter, where the county executive proposes a budget, and the authority in the charter is that the budget is proposed by the executive, adopted by the council, and then we have a process where there's amendments, possibly a veto, and then even a situation where a budget isn't enacted and we have a budget by operation of law. So, I mean, as a suggestion, you're not by ordinance compelling an action that under the Home Rule Charter is the authority of the executive, though through the process you may be getting to the same legislative and executive priorities through the budget process.
Then, yeah, I'm just going down.
Number 3.
Number 3.
Okay.
That actually makes a lot of sense to me, because doing it during a budget amendment makes sense. So I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, and the reason for that is that the ordinance limits future councils and not allowing them to use the budget amendment process, which is also very highly prescriptive to county council. The county executive must present 2 budget amendments, and there's a specific form and fashion and way you must deal with them.
Yeah. Now, again, I agree with that piece. 4 and 5, why were they eliminated?
Number 4 was eliminated because it attempted to, that goes back to Mr. Heckman, it attempted to talk about what an emergency was, and it could have been an all-inclusive list. I pulled it out because since we are no longer committing the money, it is still an emergency stabilization fund, but defining what an emergency is very, very difficult. So that's why I cut that out. And number 5 sort of went along with that because if you look, this is a financial stabilization fund will only be accessed when the result of the emergency expenditures would likely exceed 2% of the current year budgeted general fund expenditures, including transfers out. So I didn't really know how to capture the part of transfers out. I didn't know if those transfers out were to the special revenue fund, were those transfers out to monies that came in and out for grants. Do you count hotel tax in there? Do you not count hotel tax? It's very general, and that's why I say that number. I calculated it out at $2 million, between $2 million and $4 million, depending on what formula I used. Now I couldn't get below $2 million, which specifically would exclude an emergency like the Melitus building had you had no other money, which is not the case, thankfully, for the county. But when you start talking about what is an emergency and then limiting the amount of money and you don't have anything else, even council could not say, well, Mr. Executive, we don't want to cut services. And he could say, well, the ordinance says this doesn't fit the definition of an emergency.
And I just, if I could interject here, this was the issue that I had when the previous executive spent down the fund balance without tapping this when the state didn't pass a budget. And he cited this, and I thought it was ridiculous. So I think you're correct as far as defining what an emergency is. I think the state not passing a budget probably qualifies as one.
Yeah, and so, and then number 4, cannot is the restricted, should not be considered in whole or in part as available funds, approval in the budget process. Cannot goes to that committed language. We still have the stabilization fund. It still should not be considered. This gets it to a point where it's put aside. We know what the funds are going to be. It's defined within the budget process. But it sort of gets to the point of the initial intent of this was sort of like out of sight, out of mind. We know it's there. It's reasonably accessible, not committed, but it's reasonably accessible. And we would have to come to you with a budget amendment or whatever the case may be to access those funds. And for the new members of council, excluding Mr. Heckman, who's been here before, the county executive, once a budget is passed, within an org in the budget, so let's just say the director of administration's budget, which is one of the higher budgets, you can move up to 10% of money between line items. Other than that, you must go to council with a budget amendment to be able to move money around. There are also other restrictions, like the county executive can't create positions and things like that without the approval of county council, but that's a really big one. So any tapping of this money, so to speak, and moving it, since it goes from the fund balance to another org, would absolutely have to come before county council, because there's no way around it in the budget otherwise.
And from a charter standpoint too, the charter says that the budget proposed by the county executive is a comprehensive budget of all funds, and at this point we have this, separate area or separate set of funds that aren't even being budgeted, contrary to the home rule charter.
Well, I mean, look, I already made my comments about what I thought of this. But, I mean, from a legal standpoint, it is accounted for. It's just, I mean, it's in a fund. Now, we're just discussing whether or not that's necessary. I mean, I hear what you're saying, Tim. I mean, it is accounted for in the budget in the sense that it's set up as a separate bucket.
Is it being budgeted?
Isn't it?
It's set up in a separate bucket.
Yeah.
It's on the financial statements, but it doesn't go through, or it didn't go through the regular. I mean, it was proposed by the county executive, but if that fund was not funded according to this ordinance, if that fund was not funded appropriately, it would befall council to fund it.
Right.
Otherwise, it'd be in violation of their law, which is not part of the budget that's not something in the budget process.
I think we can all agree the last thing we want is to get into a legal fight between.
no.
But I like Mr. Kusick was going. Where did we leave off?
We were
I
at
think we're number
five. Well, the new number 7, the new number 5.
Yeah.
That's or budget amendment,
That's
ordinance
fine.
or budget amendment.
Yeah, same thing.
Number 6 is the same thing. C was struck out because the consequences. I don't know. It just sounded very parochial, fire and brimstone. I mean, if it's an emergency, it will be very clearly articulated what the consequences are. That was, and I took out the word emergency because we have to describe the situation. So using this money in a budget amendment would obviously come with a description of what we're doing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing your due diligence as council members. So that just talks about what you guys, as council members, would do.
All right. Want to keep going?
And then number 7, the county should begin to restore the financial stabilization fund in the year following the use. The county executive should submit a plan for the reduction. So all those things are in there. The language that was taken out was the language that specifically called for 2-year limits binding potentially future councils and future executives. That sort of flew in the face of the county code and the home rule charter and the admin code. And then on page 8, the last thing is just a renumbering of number 8. And then I believe there are no other changes.
Yeah, it shouldn't be.
And that's just a resuscitation of all the changes.
So essentially, we still have a stabilization fund, but it's more of a recommendation of the amount. We're leaving the 5% in, and we're getting rid of references to what the emergency is. And
Correct. The stuff that was pulled out in large part was simply just the things that bound future councils, bound future executives, and ran afoul of the budget process that was prescribed in the home rule charter and admin code.
Mr.
Can you just paint a picture then? So if we change this, amend the ordinance, and it's sitting in a non-committed fund, and anyone do something malicious, what's the procedure then for getting it out? And
we would come to council with a budget amendment and say, this is what we are going to do. This is our plan. This is our intention. And this is how we're going to either replenish that money or what we're going to do in the next budget process is show you that we can bring the funds back to the stabilization fund or make the adjustments accordingly in the budget process. And then you guys, as members of council, guys and girls, can say, hey, can say, yes, this is what we want to do, or no, we want to amend the budget to make these changes in future years, then follow that budget process through to the end. And the budget amendment process is very important because we're going to come with budget amendments because we've created new positions already, and we're moving some money around and shifting priorities in a way that is in the best interest of the taxpayers. And I think that this will just allow us to keep following those processes that are prescriptive under the Home Rule Charter and the Admin Code.
Now, do you see using this fund to fund, so the intention of it is emergency, whether we change the title of it or ordinance of it, so budgeting for, if we put it all into payroll or expenses that way, that's not a emergency. I mean, that's a long-term obligation, in my opinion.
I would agree with you on that. And I will tell you this. We have an unrestricted, unreserved fund balance that is healthy. I believe it exceeds the emergency stabilization fund at this point based on the unaudited numbers that are out there. Now, that could change when the external auditors come back and finalize our financial statements. We're very lucky in that regard. I don't foresee using this emergency stabilization fund. However, I also want to make sure that the county executive, myself, and the county council is being compliant with the Home Rule Charter and the Administrative Code to the best of their abilities, and that's what this looks to do.
I would assume it's treated like a transfer as well, wouldn't it?
It would be considered a,
process between
yeah,
council and the executive.
correct.
So even though this is unassigned and not committed, it doesn't necessarily give Lamont or the county executive any unilateral power to prescribe the funds at will. He still has to come, or the county council executive still has to come to us to determine if that's good, right?
That's correct.
So that's
once
right.
and to give you a little bit, so once the 2018 budget was set, when Mr. McClure became the county executive, he inherited that budget. And the changes in that budget have to come before this council to have it changed.
Right.
When we set the 2019 budget, that is a consensus between the executive and council, and then the executive can enact that budget in a manner that is prudent in the best interest of the taxpayers. And if he needs changes at that point, he would have to come back to county council. So with that stabilization fund being there, that it would just remain there.
Right, so even though this is not locked, it still has to go through the proper process to be allocated.
Correct, yes.
Okay, and this is compliant with the Home Rule Charter, as written.
As written, it's been looked at by the solicitors. It is also compliant with the standards laid out in GASB 54. You could see that from our external auditors. And we took great pains to do that.
Right, okay. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding it at a simple level.
Any other questions for Mr. Barron or Mr. Brennan?
Then I guess my next question, since you brought it up, is what will change from the previous 8 budgets to the one that you will present to us next year based on what you've proposed here?
You will see no physical change in the budget other than there may be a movement of that particular fund, the Emergency Stabilization Fund, to an uncommitted line item in the budget. So but it will say Emergency Stabilization Fund. You will be able to find it and what that number is.
Okay.
I have a question, Steve. The Gadsby, that's been around for quite a while, I believe.
Not going anywhere. Not going anywhere.
No, but I mean, it's going way back when it was for. If we really want to get right down to it, the 5 to 15% that's recommended through the accounting groups, that also is just our total cash on hand. I mean, that can be applied to anything. That's not committed.
Correct. Yeah.
So I mean, I guess, and this was always, as I read this, and I know this started under the Stouf administration, and it was idea we have to have, and I know it came out of fiscal affairs. You know, I thought it was more confusing than helpful, that we should have something for a pocket for this, a pocket for that, a pocket for this. I guess my point is, let's say, and we're not, we're keeping and frankly, I could see getting rid of this financial stabilization account. But that being said, we keep it the way it's written here. It's still, though, considered, when you get right down to it, if this went away and this money just, let's say, went into the budget, unrestricted, that's what you'd end up looking at when you see what cash you have on hand to fulfill Gadsby.
Ultimately, that all trickles down, if you read our budgets and financial statements, ultimately it all trickles down to one bottom line number.
Right.
And what ends up happening is when regulators and folks come in and look at our financial statements, they see that bottom line. But what Gadsby 54 tried to do, and Gadsby in general tries to do, is standardize financial statements so that when a regulator is looking at the financial statement, they're comparing apples and apples between like Northampton and Lehigh, Northampton and Lackawanna, and those types of things. So,
is this something that exists? Have you researched to see if this is in other areas?
Gadsby 54.
No, I mean the stabilization type fund.
I've heard of other people calling it stabilization funds. Some people call it lock boxes. Some people call it rainy day fund. There's a whole bunch of fancy names for it, but there are other places that do this. We're also lucky enough that we have the stabilization fund plus a very healthy unassigned,
right,
pool of money as well. Sorry.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
That's okay.
I was in the jail. They let me out. The changes in language that you're proposing cannot and should not make only, again, is that to make it less severe, or is there, because I realize you just went through all of that, and I apologize.
No, that's okay. It's more to give options to county council and the county executive in presenting this, and also not to intentionally run afoul or unintentionally run afoul of the administrative code and home rule charter. And that's a lot of the reasons why the budget amendment process was also invoked in this, because previously it said only by ordinance. And the other thing is, in a budget amendment, if you have a true emergency, this actually helps county council and the county executive administer the government, because an ordinance, it takes 30 days for it to be enacted. A budget amendment is immediate, so it actually helps us in an emergency.
Thanks.
Are there any? Oh, Mr. McGee.
Yeah, I'm in support of it, and I'm clearer on it now. I did read through it earlier. I came in early today and read through it, so I do understand it, and I am in support of it. I know I'm not on the committee, but I will address it when it's brought up at the meeting. Thank you.
I'm in agreement with this, and the reason is, I think there was a big question, I think when John was talking about it, there was a question of stripping language away, which is not true. That's not what is being done. It's cleaning it up. And there are many different ways to look at committed, assigned, unassigned, but the council always has the right to amend anything, no matter what happens. So you're not taking anything away from the council at all. And you can rewrite moving dollars from committed to unassigned. Is that correct? That's what this is about, just moving it?
It's really what it's all about, just moving it into that different, and yes, and it's being more compliant, I would say, with the administrative code and home rule charter.
Yeah, I want to go to Mr. Klusik's point about executives would get into the budget, into the fund balance, and they would be spending. I mean, the budget is the fundamental job of council. I mean, if there's one job we do, if we didn't have to worry about the budget, probably send us home and have a computer, and maybe even the budget, spit out what it thinks is the most appropriate action.
You're way more fun than a computer, Mr.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Barron. I'll add that to. Anyway, the thing is, Yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally our job to keep tabs on these folks. I've served both in the administration and council, and sure, everybody that puts together a budget in the administration will come to your budget and say it's bare bones. But if they're any good, it's 5 to 10% padding is put in, and that includes the judges. So maybe more on their side. But the thing is, like you mentioned about filling positions and whatnot, it looks like there might be quite a few, so we don't know where we're going to be going next year with budgeting. But I feel comfortable, at least in my ability, or hopefully I feel hopefully I can do it, in that watching what the administration does. I mean, if they're putting together budgets which are just tearing into the to what we have in our budget, I think we have a lot of reasons to ask questions. Where are you going? What are you doing? So I guess, and maybe this came from a different perspective, and I'm not going to, I don't know. I just happen to have a great deal of respect for county council as a body and what it does and its members, but I don't see a problem with what you did. I mean, I agree with Mr. Werner to a degree. I think some of this language has been cleaned up. I made it clear how I feel about the actual stabilization fund, but thank you for providing your take on it. Mr. Werner.
There were a lot of questions about whether this will weaken things, and I think we're already under the gun. Disclosure's a policy, and disclosure has to be done with everything we do. It's required. So when something's done like this, you're committed and you're also transparent. And I think that's where the importance is to and I have to tell you, we went through so much with GASB 54 in the past, and restricted, committed, unassigned, assigned. It was very confusing. I think this helps you clear it up.
Just so you have a copy of the email, and Bob, if you did get one, I might not have another one for you, Lori, but I'll give you one then. It just shows we're in compliance with GASB 54.
Are there any other questions for these folks or any other folks, or do we have any discussion? Anybody want? Yes.
This is a separate issue from this if we're done on that. At the last meeting where we approved the controller, there were a couple of issues that have come up. One involved whether or not the controller should have a part-time or the ability to have a part-time job and the interpretation of the charter with regards to that. So I was here when we changed it to a full-time position, and my recollection is it was never our intention that the controller wouldn't be able to referee soccer games, or if he wanted to sell real estate on a Saturday afternoon and do an open house. That was never my recollection is that was never what we intended to do. And at times it was used against the previous controller politically in a way that it was probably petty. So I think what council needs to consider is the ordinance that I'm putting forward that would change the charter to just say the controller will be full-time. Okay? It should be up to the controller if he wants to do something on the weekends or at 4:30. I don't have a problem with that as long as there's no conflict of interest. At the time that the change was made, we didn't want a controller to be an accountant where the county would just be one of his clients.
Right.
That's what the intention was. It wasn't you can't ref soccer or football or, you can't. So I think we need to make that change. So we just say that it's a full-time job, and that's it.
I'll co-sponsor that with you, Mr. Kuzik.
Okay. And then the other issue that's come up is the question about the pay. So again, there was a reluctance on some of my colleagues previously to raise the pay of someone who they didn't necessarily agree with.
That's a new standard. No one gets a raise.
So, again, I think that it's time to look at the position and not the person in it. And I'm also proposing that we raise the pay of the controller beginning with the next election, $10,000. And I believe it's been at least 8 years since that's been raised. And it wasn't really raised, it was just changed to full-time. So I think we should allow the controller to have a part-time job that doesn't conflict with what they do here, and they should be paid more. So, and my hope is that, in this interim where we have a controller that's not running, that we can make these changes to the position, not to the person in the job. Thank you.
I agree with you, actually. Especially when they did that article on the nonprofits and some of those salaries, I was amazed. And I mean, I know this government work, you're not going to get rich, but I think we should try and at least give some consideration to salaries. So yes. All right. Anything else? Well, I mean, well, as a committee. Again, I always look at committees differently than it is modern. I always just saw committees are a group of people come together. Well, I mean, it's on the agenda. Do we want to make a recommendation? Well, our recommendation, whether we recommend it or not, it's on the agenda. Do I have a motion to make a recommendation to move this to council? All right, we don't need a second on that. Okay. All in favor? On the committee?
Yeah, I'm going to be a no. I think there are some good things in here, but I'm concerned about weakening of the council's standing with regards to the fund balance. That's all. But there are some pieces of the language in here that are improvements.
So I think of the 4 members, we have 3 that recommend we move it apart. And Mr. Cusick does too. He's just giving us an idea of where he's coming from. All right, we recommend that it be moved to the agenda which it's on.
Yeah, it's not all bad.
And if that's all, thank you. It's over.
It's over. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Oh, my God. It's over. It's done.
Hey, John.
The formality's killing me. I know. Yeah.